Thank you. And Nathan, would you like to introduce Kim officially?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'd all like to thank you, Kim, for coming in and speak to us today about such a timely topic. I've known Kim for a few years now. She is a faculty member in the IO Ph.D. program at Central Michigan University. Fire up, right? She earned her Ph.D. in 2008 from the University of South Florida, where she worked with Tammy Allen. Before coming to Central Michigan, she taught for a time at Wayne State in Detroit in their IO program. And she's going to talk to us today about, again, what I think is a really timely topic. It's certainly something we see in the news a lot in recent years, and that is skepticism about science. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
Thank you so much for having me. As I've been saying, I'm really excited about this topic. I would love to see a lot more research in it, and specifically well-done research. So, I think I ask this every time, but can you guys see my slides? Very good. Okay, so I figured no better way than to illustrate science skeptical attitudes than with memes. So we'll be showing some memes today. I'm going to give you a brief introduction about how I fell into this area, what we know now about science skeptical attitudes, a little bit of empirical work that we've been getting started on, and where I think it would be good to go from here, and then I'll have some time for questions. And with pictures. That should help, right? So how did I get here? It has been a bit of a path, because I started out by studying mentoring and pro-social and antisocial work behaviors, particularly as they relate to job stress. So can job stress manifest in the workplace as organizational citizenship behavior and counterproductive work behavior? But in studying job stress, I got to know more and more about health psychology, and I'm teaching the health psychology class here. Technically, my line here is as a occupational health psychologist. And in doing so, I realized they had so much research on science skepticism already, because they have to fight this all the time. They're fighting, first it was anti-vaccine, and now it's things like mask use and personal protective equipment. So bringing in some of the information we have from there to fill in some of the gaps that we have in the knowledge. So I think a few years ago, we were starting to see things like this come out, which aren't anti-science, but they are certainly anecdotes, and they've definitely become sensationalized, and I think leading to some dangerous things like Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop, for example. So she has some recommendations that are definitely not based in science. She kind of gets into like the crystal healing, things like that. Of different kinds of science skepticism, and as we've been saying, it's gotten more visible recently, and a lot of it does overlap with politics. I'm going to try to keep talking about science, anti-science, or science skeptical attitudes in general, but to what degree can we have alternative facts? This, I'm going to send out the PowerPoint slides when I'm done, but this book is a free book from RAND, R-A-N-D. It's a really good think tank. It is not associated with a political party, although they do a lot of political research. And they published a book that's freely available on truth decay, how to study it, what we can do about it. About 10 years ago, we were working with popular press books like this, The Death of Expertise, which makes the argument that we have made education free and accessible to all, but you get what you pay for. And that education, people access as much as they think they need, and then they drop out. If you are reading Wikipedia, you might think you have enough knowledge to make a judgment or an evaluation, but as experts, we know that that's not enough on things, right? You can read a Wikipedia page about the MBTI and think of that it's, you know, a useful selection tool or something like that. As experts, we know better. But when you're looking for your keys and you think you've got them, you stop looking. And when people are seeking information and they think they have enough, they stop looking. It takes effort to maintain an education. So they get just enough to have that Dunning-Kruger effect, and then they withdraw from their free, unmonitored education. So we might have sold ourselves a bit short, devalued the importance of knowledge. And when everyone deserves to have knowledge and everyone has knowledge, and it devalues the purpose of having experts. So that's something they warn about in here in The Death of Expertise. And I'm going to be talking mostly about false information today that has no intent to harm. For the most part, it does, right? So it's hard to avoid. So what are science skeptical attitudes? In general, an attitude is a general evaluation that has affective, cognitive, and behavioral components. It's a tendency to behave in a certain way, and it's associated with liking something, and your thoughts tend to align when we're talking about an attitude. Sometimes we have a feeling about something that doesn't line up with our thoughts, like smoking cigarettes. We usually know it's bad for you. You probably shouldn't do it. People who do that, you know, are a certain way, but the affect doesn't line up. In an attitude, the affect and the cognitive components tend to line up. In particular, science skeptical attitudes have to do with the distrust of the scientific method, the experts, or its findings, and they're usually related. If you don't trust that we take careful measurements, you're not going to trust the experts or the findings. So this is what facilitates specific anti-science beliefs. So a science skeptical attitude will facilitate an anti-science belief about vaccines, for example. And I'm going to define that here as an idea that's contradictory to scientific consensus. Everybody has some, because we can't be an expert on everything. When the bubble burst in 2008, and they were saying, should we give bailouts to the auto companies? Then everybody had an opinion, but not everyone necessarily knew enough to. So that's a little bit not what I'm focusing on here today. I don't think it's not worth focusing on, but there's already a lot here. So what I am going to be talking about is a cognitive distortion or illusionary thinking, heuristics, any of those terms I think apply. And there's a hint of arrogance there, that you know as much as the expert or more, or they haven't considered this thought that you have, right? So early on in the pandemic, my friend's mom posted to Facebook, if malaria treatment helps COVID, which we now know it doesn't, if malaria treatment helps COVID, how come we aren't giving malaria vaccines, right? So she did not have a good understanding of immunology. She had a very logical thought, right? The thought process was very logical and very, it made sense if you don't understand the difference between a treatment and a vaccine, right? But that's the problem, is it's these missing gaps that people don't know they have. Dunning and Kruger refer to this as hypocognition. You don't know what you don't know. So they think they have the full picture. And because of that, it leads to a confidence that we wouldn't expect. So here's an example of something I found on the internet, a really good source. I have an immune system, so I don't need a vaccine. However, if you know any people who study vaccines or immunology, you'll know that the immune system is actually very complicated. And because we have an immune system is why we need vaccines. Vaccines work because of our immune system, right? So in order to have this cell-mediated immune response where we have B cells that are activated by, become activated and cause these antibodies, that's why vaccines are beneficial to us. This image here links to a video, a 5-minute video about how complicated the immune system is that I show in all my classes, and my kids love it too. So I recommend that one. Something that's related to this very clearly is the measles problem, where we have people who are against the measles vaccine in particular, saying that natural immunity is better. That's literally the opposite. What measles does is it wipes out your B cell antibodies that you already have, your memory B cells. So it erases your immunity you already have for up to a year following measles. HIV is a little bit worse because it works on this part, the mediated part by the T cell. So they're quite different in that sense. Also, HIV being a retrovirus will change your DNA, whereas measles does not. So here we have your B cells are wiped out. You lose the immunity you've already gained, and anti-vaxxers are saying natural immunity is better. That's the exact opposite of what is true there. So those are some examples and some beliefs that got me interested in science skeptical attitudes. So then I had to go into the attitude literature and what do we know about attitudes? How are they formed? And what do they consist of? So in the 1950s and 60s, at about the same time, two groups of psychologists came up with the idea on their independently of attitudes. And Katz kind of did the most organization of those thoughts. So I tend to rely on those citations, but mostly it comes from conditioning. Things that we've learned through rewards and punishment in our lives direct our attitudes. If you have had fun driving in sports cars and having great time with your friends, you might have good attitudes towards sports cars. But if you know someone who spent way too much money on one and you don't like that person as much in the first place, then your attitudes might be bad. So attitudes come from conditioning since we're very young. Egally, for example, says that attitudes propagate or they preclude more attitudes. If you already have an attitude about sports cars, this might translate into other types of recreational vehicles, right? So they may relate in that sense. Katz says that they serve 5 functions and that these functions are extremely important. They determine how we express and how we can manipulate these attitudes. And those values, those functions include values. So it tells other people what values are, which we know is inherently motivating. It tells, it helps you belong. It gives you a social adjustment. So if I have the same attitudes as you, we can be friends, right? It can serve a utilitarian purpose. If I know what I like and I don't like, my life's a lot easier than having to figure it out every time. Ego defense is a big reason for attitudes. Having certain attitudes protects us and makes us have pride. And then sometimes we think we have attitudes that direct how we learn knowledge. So we might have attitudes about gaining knowledge, which is a little bit different than the others. So Katz mostly look at this in terms of persuasion using the matching hypothesis. If you want to convince someone to buy Tide detergent, and the reason why they use all detergent is for utilitarian reasons because it's cheaper, then you have to match them on that function and say, look, it's cheaper, but you have to use more of it. So it's not actually cheaper to use. If you tried to influence that attitude with a different function, it wouldn't be as effective. So if I say, don't use all detergent, use Tide detergent, because that's what all the cool kids are doing, that wouldn't be as useful if you have a utilitarian purpose for that attitude towards detergents. And I chose detergents on purpose because a lot of this research has been done in marketing. I think I initially, very early, had the question, well, does it relate to personality? To what extent is this a trait? And there's some relationship and overlap there. Are people who are more prideful or sensitive to ego defense more likely to have ego defense attitudes? And there's some relationship there, but overall not convincing. Everyone tries to protect their pride. That's pretty universal. Everyone wants to belong. There are a couple researchers who would say that's a need to belong. So there are some relationships, but not very clear. I'm going to give you some examples. This is what a virologist wears to protect themselves from a virus, but don't worry, your bandana probably works too. To me, this is an example of a utilitarian attitude because this person is saying they don't work, so you shouldn't like them. I don't like them. They don't work. That was shared by a politician's child, for the record, politician's son. Here we have, you can use anything as a mask because it's not about safety. It's about compliance. I thought this one shows you values. They're not saying that they don't necessarily work, but they're also saying it's more about compliance. And my value is to not comply. I don't care if it harms me or if it harms you. I'm not going to comply, right? I think that one relates a lot to this one. When you're the only one without a mask in Walmart, you might feel like a lion amongst the sheep. I can't tell who posted this, somebody who is against wearing masks or somebody who's making fun of them. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. We would refer to that as a POE, P-O-E. They are people who pretend to be on the other side and make outlandish claims. But the state of things are such that we can't tell if they're being serious or not. So this might be a POE, but they're saying that they feel like a lion when they're amongst the sheep. To me, that's ego defensive and ego promoting. This is called a compliance mask, if you haven't seen one. This is just to skirt the law and say, look, I have a mask on, what's the problem? And I think she knows it's not working, and I think she knows that what she's doing here, this does signal to me values, but because she's wearing this out in public, to me it's social expressive. She's telling everyone, like, these are what I believe in. If you believe in this, we can be friends, but if you're not, then I don't want to talk to you anyway, right? And then I have here, prolonged use of the mask produces hypoxia, which I think is a very knowledge-based attitude, where we have, I know something about here, I have an understanding about oxygen and that we need it, and now I have an opinion about maths. So this is, of course, false. But moving on, those are some examples of the attitudes someone might have and some functions of that attitude. But Herrick in 1986, a little bit newer, came up with neo-functional attitude theory. They made some small adjustments to the way that the functions had been considered. And they talked about having something be reasoned and thought out versus symbolic attitudes. You might have a symbolic attitude, for example, towards Gucci or Lamborghinis, right? Because they're symbolic. No, not too many people are like, oh, I really want one because they get really good gas mileage, right? They tend not to be reasoned. You see a little bit more of that with the Tesla, right? Where some people are like, oh no, really, it's worth the money, and other people are, no, I want a car that comes to me when I ask it to on my phone. So they expect attitudes to serve multiple functions, which is a little bit different from how other people had conceptualized it. So newer research also has found that matching a message is not good enough in order to change it. If you have a utilitarian attitude towards all detergent, I want you to use Tide detergent, it's actually better to frustrate their attitude. So in this they were trying to get people to sign up for organ donation. They tried to persuade them via frustration. They had a rigged value survey that made them feel like hypocrites. Like, what do you think about these 10 things, right? Like climate change or veterans, US veterans. And then they said, oh, you love them? How much time do you spend volunteering with them? Have you sent a letter to a veteran in the past month, right? So they frustrated their value. On the other hand, they could have gotten a knowledge frustration in which they gave them a card game that had rules that didn't sound contradictory, but they were, and it made it feel like the participants felt like they couldn't play a card game. When they matched the ad for the organ donation to what was frustrated, then they got the most organ donations cards. So they had, before they left, the participants fill out an organ donation card if they wanted to, and then later on they mailed them to the organ donation site as to not be unethical. But they found that you wanted to frustrate the attitude and then address the gap. I think we see that a lot in political posts when people say they're coming after your jobs, they're coming after your safety, your life is going to be so different. Here's how I'm going to fix that, right? So they frustrate that before they give you the message or the solution to the problem that they've now made salient. So science skeptical attitudes in particular have their own nomological net. Gauchat is a he did some research on anti-science attitudes. And I don't like that term because one day I'm going to want to do some focus groups and some interviews with people who have these kinds of attitudes. And I don't want to be like, hi, I'm Dr. So-and-so with the university. We do research and I'd like you to do my research, right? I don't want to feel like I'm not, like I'm trying to do wrong by them. So I tend not to call it that. I call it science skepticism. I think most people have science skepticism, so it's not as alienating, which we know alienation and isolation is one thing that bolsters these beliefs. So if you're going to do this kind of research, there's a number of scales available. I included all of these in a recent construct validation, and they all hang together very well. You can use any of these. I like the Credibility of Science Scale by Hartman. This link will take you to the file, and it's 6 items. So I like that. On the other hand, the Negative Perception of Science Scale is very well validated, and it has 4 subsections of science skepticism. So do you distrust science because you think it goes against scripture? Do you distrust science because you think it's too hard to do? So onerous is one of the, an item for that is scientists use jargon that's too complicated to understand. You know, maybe we shouldn't use so much jargon. Then there is scientists are corrupt. So scientists take money from companies in order to find what the company has asked. And then science is limited. Like science can't answer the questions that I have in life, right? Like what happens to us when we die? So because science is limited, I just don't care to learn about it. So through the papers that I read, we put together a bit of a model of science skepticism. This is tentative, it's a working model, but I feel pretty good about it. So we know that attitudes serve 5 functions. These are somewhat malleable, but I had a lot of trouble determining, do they come before the science skepticism? They come after it? So you were science skeptical and now you have this motive. They treated it as a moderator of the persuasion interaction. But what if they came before or after? So now I know if you're frustrated, you will develop this tendency, or you'll defend your attitude even more. So what if they come before or after? And I think that that's true. I think that once you have one reason to believe in an attitude, it will motivate your reasoning on the other functions of the attitude. So if you begin having a science skeptical attitude because all of your friends do, and you want to belong, and then you move to a different county or something, are you still going to have that science skeptical attitude? And right now it looks like, yeah, they're pretty immutable once we get them. Persuasion is not very effective. Instead, we find that these other functions tend to fall in line with the others. So if you have a social function of your science skepticism, you will then become attached to it. Your values will reflect it. Your understanding, so your utilitarian functions will also reflect that attitude as well. So I think it's cyclical in that sense. This is consistent with what Gauchat says. So Gauchat says there are 3 reasons for anti-science attitudes, including poor scientific literacy, social embeddedness, and religion. So anthropologists can look at religion in the IO realm. I tend to avoid that, which is one reason why I would use Morgan's typology of heretical, onerous, corrupt, and limited. So again, the 4 from the construct validation, they found 4 subfacets. Sometimes I prefer to use the Morgan scale so I can leave out the parts about scripture. That's an option too. But those to me fall in line with what the functions of the attitudes are, right? Like social reasons, values. Religion would tell you science is not useful. Scripture is useful. If you're not sure, there are answers already in the scripture. You don't need science. So that's a utilitarian purpose. It's also an embedded purpose and a values purpose. So I think it reflects that fairly well. We tried to replicate this because what Morgan did is they asked people, why do you think other people might have skepticism towards science? And there are some problems with that. So we were concerned about if we would be able to find the same thing in a different sample. We did try to do that. Are people really going to admit, though, if they have an attitude towards maybe fracking or some political things, if they're just in it for the money? Or would they say, oh, the only reason why I care about masks is because I feel vulnerable and I feel emasculated when I wear a mask, right? We weren't sure we would find that. So I do have some concerns about methodology there and moving that forward. But to summarize, we have these attitudes that are formed from conditioning through norms, exposure, and rewards and punishment. These attitudes form because of the 5 functions that they serve, and they're maintained. How do we maintain these deep, conflicting beliefs about science when all the facts and all the experts are against you? How can you maintain these anti-science beliefs and these science skeptical attitudes? And that's where we were looking at epistemic beliefs. So where does knowledge come from? These are beliefs we have, they're epistemic beliefs, where you think that knowledge comes from and where I think knowledge comes from. So some of the epistemic problems that people have when they maintain science skeptical attitudes is, one of them is certainty. So they dismiss incomplete knowledge, and that became very clear during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we had research coming out. It wasn't coming out fast enough, and people were inventing their own treatments, and they were inventing their own protective behaviors, right? So we saw how people really struggle with incomplete knowledge. They distrust science, they distrusted knowledge when it did come out because they had already given up on science. They said, look, you can't answer, you don't have all the answers, so you must have none of them. It sounds improbable, but it's actually fairly common. People dismiss incomplete knowledge. Structure. So, that's for the record why people dismiss theories in general, right? They don't realize that perhaps gravity is a theory. There are things we don't know about it, but they still act like it's a thing. You don't see too many people jumping off a cliff saying, oh, it's just a theory, right? But when people realize that, when they hear the word theory, they assume it's incomplete and they dismiss it. Instead of saying, wow, we're 95% sure, maybe we should go with this for now, right? So structure is the inability to weigh evidence and to synthesize it. So if you have 10 scientific experts saying that the Earth is this age, and you have one person in your local community saying it's not that age, we're legally required to give both sides of the story in the media to some degree. That's a bit of an overstatement. But that balancing needs to reflect the amount of evidence, and it doesn't. It's pretty much 50-50. So people are unable to weigh risks as well. So what's the risk of a vaccine versus the risk of getting COVID, right? People can't really weigh evidence like that. That supports the anti-science beliefs. People justify their scientific skepticism because they don't know the methods that led to it. They don't realize how thoroughly and carefully this research has been done. A study of climate scientists found that more than 99.99% of climate scientists think that the changes in the climate are due to human intervention because of what humans have done, whereas only 95% of weather scientists think that humans are the cause of climate change. So the further you get from that science, the less you believe that science. The more embedded in it you are, the more you understand it. It's like trying to talk to managers about using structured interviews. They're not the ones who did the research, and it's hard to make that argument. I don't know how carefully we've checked that over and over. Or when an undergrad is applying to grad school and they say, oh, but I don't, the GREs aren't perfect. They've been really well tested. No, they're not perfect. They're really far from. But the further you are from that, the more you distrust the science that went into it. And then people distrust, or they make epistemic beliefs based on source. I read a New York Times article recently that says, do your own research has become the battle cry of QAnon. And that's consistent with my research as well. The more you have these conspiracy theories, so QAnon is a conspiracy theory, the more you have these, the more you think you're the one who has done the research. So when you encourage people to do your own research, well, maybe don't trust your doctor. Maybe go on the internet and see if you should have vaccines. The more you encourage that distrust, the more you're encouraging people to remove themselves from that research, right? So justification was the prior epistemic problem, but source encourages that by saying we shouldn't trust experts, right? Do your own research. We should not be doing our own research. I should not be doing my own mechanical work in my car. I should not be doing my own IT work. I should not be trying to fix my own computer. I don't have the knowledge. So I don't think people should be doing their own research. I think they need to talk to a trusted expert. And I realize it's a privilege to have one, but doing your own research is, most people are not equipped to do that. Then there's one other thing I think that supports this ignorance, or it would be insulation from fact. Because of algorithms in Facebook and in Google, and because of denial, and through trying to avoid the facts that are inconsistent with what we like, because we've unfriended those people, or we've taken ourselves off of Facebook and gone to Parlay, or because we look at certain news. So Fox News is left leaning, Fox News is right leaning, Fox News, not Fox News opinion, which is very different. Because of this, we don't even hear the facts that are contradictory to what we thought. If you're only hearing facts that say another person got the immunization and then they died, and then this person got the immunization and they had a stroke, this person, if you keep hearing that over and over and you don't hear the other side, it's going to change your opinion. And that's how people become so embedded in this. And then it gives them the illusion of fact, right? It gives them the illusion. I've heard every story that came about vaccines causing problems, and you don't even know of those. So I know more than you. And I expect this to get kind of big in the next couple of weeks, because they're vaccinating a lot of older people right now who are 75 years and up, because that's all the vaccines we have at the moment. Some of them were already sick and not doing so well. And so some of them are going to, unfortunately, pass away within 2 weeks of the vaccination. They probably would have anyway, but it looks really bad, right? They're going to say the death rate after the vaccine looks so bad, but it's predictable based on the rest of the death rate. So here we have epistemic errors and insulation from fact coming from these science skeptical attitudes. So they perpetuate, maintain, support our epistemic errors. They help insulate us from fact. They help us to weigh that information in an incorrect way, but it does help us to do that. And then what happens after we have these things happen? What happens after the science attitudes? So when you want to know how an attitude informs behavior, it's pretty much the theory of planned behavior, or the theory of reasoned action. Those come from, it's mostly applied in the health psychology literature, like why do people wash their hands after the restroom? When do people use personal protective equipment? It's been very effective in showing when people in particular use condoms, because condom use is something that health psychologists want to support, but didn't know how. And they said that it's a function partially of attitudes, your social norms, and whether you have control of attitude also is persuasion. So behaviors, and then also changing those attitudes. How do we do that? So moving that into the model, epistemic errors and insulation from fact are going to precede the specific anti-science beliefs. If I have science skeptical attitudes, I will maintain those, and I will support them through making these epistemic errors and insulating myself from fact, which will lead to specific anti-science beliefs, such as vaccines are dangerous, or they're not effective, or that masks will give you hypoxia, right? And then this will in turn lead to some decisions or intentions to behave, which will in turn lead to behavior. There's a bit of a gap there, but overall, I think this is a good skeleton of a model to get things started. So that's the whole thing. When you add up all the pieces that the lab is currently working on now, and how are we working on that? You will find this information in a variety of literatures except for IO. That's the place where, and then I'm gonna tell you, 2 years ago, I was sitting in my office, really scratching my head, going, science skeptical attitudes are only gonna affect the decision makers. They're gonna help you decide what choices to make, but it's not going to affect the employees. It's going to be so hard to see science skeptical attitudes manifest in line workers. They don't make decisions. Doesn't matter if they follow science or not. Oh my gosh. And then COVID happened and it was so unfortunate, but we saw it everywhere. And now we see it in the rise of QAnon, which is very scary, very dangerous, very, very dangerous. I think it's more scary than COVID-19 personally, because it's going to stick around for a bit longer and there's no sudden rush to make a vaccine for it. And even if QAnon gets shut down, there'll be another. So if you don't know, QAnon is a bit of a doomsday cult that believes that people in charge, particularly elite Democrats and people in Hollywood, run a satanic, pedophile, cannibalistic group, and that there will be two major events. One is the Great Awakening, in which everyone in the country realizes at once that Q was correct the whole time, and oh gosh, some kind of mass arrests that they think will happen. They thought the National Guard showing up at the inauguration was to arrest the Democrats, and they were going to hand the power back over to the Republicans. We might call this something like moving the goalposts, or each time one Great Awakening has failed, the storm, that's what they call it. When they're going to do the mass arrests, that's the storm. They say the storm is going to happen on election day. Didn't happen. Okay, when they count the votes, it's going to happen. Didn't happen. Okay, on inauguration day, it's going to happen. Didn't happen. Now they're saying March 4th, because in the original Declaration of Independence, that's when they said was the beginning of each new term for the president. So now they're holding out for that. And when that passes, they will have they'll move the goalpost. Well, it's been shown before. So we're seeing it in line workers. We're seeing it in the news. 67%, that's a different slide, but 67% of Republicans believe some or all of QAnon. QAnon is an anonymous person on the internet who makes these claims that, we'll touch on that later, but it's everywhere is the point. It's everywhere. So if you want to find more about it, you can look into that. It's interesting, but really depressing. So highly recommend you set a timer before you go into it to protect yourselves from the emotional labor of it. And you can also look for it in judgment and decision-making. There is a scale called the BS receptivity scale, and it has these pseudo-profound statements like, time is immortal and it is manifested as abstract beauty, or something to that effect, right? So it's these pseudo profound statements, and the more people believe that those sound profound, the more they tend to fall into these kinds of things, right? So I've got a bit more on that here, like what else it relates to. So we tried to replicate Morgan's 4 factors by asking people what they believe. Morgan asked people what they think other people believe about anti-science, but we know that people are really incorrect about that. Police officers use incorrect beliefs to judge if assault victims are being honest. They say, she wasn't crying enough, there's no way she was actually assaulted, right? So we know other people make bad judgments. Let's just ask the source what they actually think. But we focus too cleanly on having a replication of Morgan. I don't think we asked the question too well. I think it may have caused some impression management or denial, but essentially we said, what are some reasons you may have some distrust for science, scientific methodology, or experts? We used 200 MTRIC workers just to get us started. We had them list 5 reasons why they hold these negative beliefs, and in general, and then in specific areas, 336 quotable utterances, and then we had 2 researchers code each one. We identified 13 themes that fall very closely to Morgan, such as science is limited, scientists are biased, and then scientists are just unlikable people is one that emerged. So unfortunately, we found that it correlated with with education, such that people with greater education had more anti-science attitudes. And that's probably not too incorrect, because we are also taught that part of the scientific method is to have that skepticism and to replicate everything. The scale, we didn't really have a scale because we had themes, but they did correlate with the COSS, the credibility of science scale that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to give you some more data as it relates to the COSS and not our utterances. And one of those is that college major had a small effect on quite a few of the variables, such as interpersonal conflict at work, intuitive decision-making, that was a negative 0.61, science skepticism, and effective orientation. College major, so I'm going to give you a bunch. These are the ones we looked at: arts and humanities, business, health and medicine, math, science, social science. Only 2 of those groups were different from the others and different from each other. I'll let you think. Which 2 are different from each other and different from the others? It was arts and humanities is significantly different from health and medicine, but the rest were neither different from arts and humanities nor health and medicine. So that's, I think, really interesting, because sometimes I think they are pitted against each other. There's some information there about practitioner communication, right, in that doctor-patient interaction, and how we can work towards those things. I think it's in there. Here's some more correlations. There's a negative 0.67 correlation between low credibility of science and scientific literacy. So these people didn't know things like that. Not all radiation is man-made. Some radiation, a lot of radiation is naturally occurring in things even like bananas, right? Light is faster than sound was not something that everyone knew, all right? So they also related strongly to benign anti-science beliefs, which I made up the scale because I was just curious, because I'm curious, like, you know, it's one thing to think that we're wearing masks so the government can control you, or, you know, maybe we just haven't looked hard enough for the Loch Ness monster, right? So that's kind of what I wanted to look at here. And there's a tremendous relationship between those, but there is a little more variance in the benign anti-science beliefs. So I think it is just fun to have, maybe. It's related to trust in others, and then populism, which we're seeing now, which is the belief that elites don't know how the rest of people live, and the only way to really be equal is to not have those experts to tell us what we already know. Oh my gosh, look at this relationship with social dominance orientation. White supremacy is anti-science. 30 to 40% of white people believe that there is systemic discrimination against white people, which is factually incorrect, right? So that is a really strong relationship. I was very surprised to see that. I think that's worth moving forward with as well. It's related to conservative political orientation, which is not what is your political group, but which groups do you have a preference for? So if you prefer to progressives, that's what this correlation shows, which I think is also, we've been hearing a lot in the news. Relates to some workplace variables such as interpersonal conflict, emotional exhaustion, and commitment to change, right? So do people who appreciate facts like commitment more? There's this interaction we found. I haven't really looked too much into it yet because I did this at about midnight last night. But if we gave them a hypothetical leader at the beginning of COVID, said, look, business is not good. I'm trying to save everyone's job. We're going to have to start working on the weekends, right? So they either said this in an inconsiderate way or in a considerate way, saying, I'm trying to save the business, or we're not doing as well as I wanted, right? So did they say in a considerate way or inconsiderate way? And then did they use facts? Did they bring in experts and use data, or did he base it on his instinct? Generally speaking, if you're going to harm your employees, you don't want to be inconsiderate and say you're doing it based on your gut instinct, apparently. So an instinctual inconsiderate leader was the least preferred, whereas the instinctual considerate leader was the most preferred. So my gut says to save this company, we have to start working on the weekends. It's better. It's more accepted than, based on the data, to save this company, we need to start working on the weekends. I was surprised, but I like data. When I broke it, so I did it in the regressions, but to visualize it, I have it broken down. This was in a low anti-science attitudes, and then this really shocked me. This was higher anti-science attitudes. I'm really surprised by this. I checked the coding like 3 times. They don't care if you're considerate or not if you use facts. They like you. But you see that whole moderation that we were showing earlier is really being driven by the more anti-science group. And I think that's because they think they're more reasoned, right? So the things we've been saying, that they have these beliefs, they think they've been looking at all the research, they think they know all the answers. I think that's showing here. I did want to point out that some people think they know the answers because they're the experts. That's a good thing. But they've looked for the keys, they think they found them, and they stopped looking for keys. That's what I think is happening here. It's hypocognition. They don't know what they don't know. Yeah, so they're more rational. They say they're more rational. So the correlation between being anti-science and using rational thought, I think that's my next slide. Yeah, is that they say they're more they say they're more effective. So I go based on what I feel is right, but they also say that they think out their decisions more. Of course, it was correlated with that ES receptivity scale. And then cognitive reflections. So this is a fun one. If it takes 30 days to cover a lily pad to cover a pond in lily pads, how many days does it take to cover half the pond in lily pads? So if it takes 30 days to cover the pond in lily pads, does it take 15 days to cover half the pond in lily pads, or 29 days? If you understand exponential growth, you'll know that it's 29 days. So the ability to get things right on the cognitive reflection scale correlated with anti-science attitudes and beliefs. They're more intuitive, 0.69 correlation. They have a higher need for closure. They need to know now. This was not part of our research, but I did look at interpersonal conflict because it came up a lot. If you think people are rude to your work, this is 0.61 correlated with intuition. We gave them a blurb about sharks, and then we asked them to recall some information. They recalled more non-existent things than people who didn't report as much interpersonal conflict. And it was correlated 0.79 with believing in like Loch Ness Monster and Yetis, which I think is so weird because, I don't know, are they manufacturing this rudeness? What is happening? That's so weird, but I think that is evidence that we should continue looking at it, but I don't think it should be interpreted on its own. So what we found is that we asked them why they distrust science, and people generally reported epistemic reasons. So because I don't believe your facts, I don't believe your scientists, those are epistemic and not so much attitudinal. But to be fair, we did ask them in kind of a backwards way. So I do have some ideas here for future research, including content analyzing Reddit and things like that. So here's a blurb from a former conspiracy theorist on why he believes in this conspiracy theory. I don't know how much good data is on the internet, right? Is it where you go to hide and just say so things because you can, or do you mean it? We don't really know. So, do that carefully, especially because, let me move on to the slide. We don't want to jump to solve the problem. I really think that we don't know what we're doing in terms of persuasion and anti-science attitudes because it's come from too many different angles that are going right to how do we persuade people? I don't think we're ready for that yet. I think there needs to be more construct development and measurement research. I don't encourage people to get involved in anything that's too narrow or trendy or won't generalize. Unfortunately, I don't think QAnon is going away anytime soon. Nonetheless, try and make sure your research is generalizable if that's your goal. You could actually upset QAnon people. So be careful how you phrase your terms, right? And where you make your how you present the information. In general, why would you want to isolate people? That's part of what causes this problem. And that's in here too. I find it very taxing, tiring, exhausting, and depressing to read the comments, right? That's the thing. People say don't read the comments. That's essentially what I do for research now. And you have to limit it, and you have to talk to other people who are scientists and can keep and help you remember, like most people aren't like that, right? I don't think you want to talk about anti or science skeptical people in a rude way. Like they're ignorant, they're doing this to themselves, they're just trying to make money, they're protecting their ego. That's not going to help us in the long run, I don't think. And, you know, if people are doing civil rights abuses, do we need to extend the olive branch? I don't have a good answer for that, except I know that I can't imagine a good reason to tell people that they're ignorant. It doesn't work. It might make you feel better. Actually, that might not be a bad reason. And then don't assume you know what they think. Actually go and ask them and talk to them. They're sometimes really happy to talk about it. So in the future, we should look at how we change and persuade attitudes. There's a Reddit for that as well. Street epistemology asks people about God and religion in particular, but some of that line of questioning, that Socratic method, might be able to deprogram people from like anti-vaccine beliefs and whatnot. I wonder how long that lasts though. At the end of the interview, they say, oh, now I believe what you believe. Or are they just going to go back to their friends and family and their news and fall back to what they thought before? So those are some thoughts I had. And then, of course, be really careful when looking at religion in the organization. That's up to you and your expertise if that's something that you want to get involved in, but I do worry about it. And with that, I want to thank my lab for helping me code all of that. I've got a couple undergrads and a couple of PhD students who are working on that. I did save some time for questions. You kind of rushed through the end there, but thank you for having me, and I'd love to hear what you have to say and to answer some questions if you have.
Thank you, Kim. So now we open it for questions.
I had a question. Actually, I have probably a million questions. Thank you so much for speaking towards this topic. I was wondering if, given that you can find this type of research in pretty much area except for IO, what should IO psychologists be doing to predict or control anti-science attitudes in our field specifically?
Right. So this is something that I was struggling with before COVID happened and people weren't wearing masks because they didn't believe in science, right? But there will always be two things. So one, we can address it within the organization, but also because of health psychology, we know that a single intervention is not effective. If you want people to stop smoking, you don't say, go to a smoking cessation program. It doesn't work. Community-wide programs are the best. So if you say no smoking is allowed in restaurants and bars, we're going to help people. We're going to connect them on the phone with resources where they can get nicotine patches. The doctors are trained on how to give referrals for this. If we make it community-wide, it's so much more effective. If you think about anorexia therapy, it works best when the whole family is involved. I think organizations play a role in reaching adults in the US. And I think that it doesn't have to, anti-science interventions don't have to be limited to your role at this organization. I think we can train critical thinking and weighing evidence and cognitive biases in the organization and hope that they translate to the employees' families and the communities. So I think that's the role. It's like health interventions and wellness interventions don't always have a positive ROI, a positive return on investment. We do it to decrease premature death and disability. And I think this is the same way. I think it's something that organizations can do to further society based on the letter of 200 organizations to the Republican senators who were going to vote against the election results. I think that they are motivated to help science succeed in the US. So that's where I see it as. I see it very idealistically and in a very broad way.
Thank you.
Jan, is it my turn? I raised my hand.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Val.
Hey, Kimberly,
Corey.
thank you very much for a really interesting talk. And I particularly appreciate the structure that you put on a really difficult problem. Helps us to organize how we can think about it. Having said that, you know this is what's coming. Having said that, you're hitting on an issue that has been troubling me for some time regarding how we partition psychological phenomena from more general sociocultural phenomena. And my worry is that we might be making a category error here. And let me explain what I mean. The idea being that we can fix these problems at the psychological level when really what's happening is a problem at a higher level of analysis, which I would call sociocultural. And oddly enough, for those who know me, the person that I would point to for revealing what we're actually dealing with here is Marx. And the distance between what we see in the environment and the conclusions that people are making about those experiences are that gap is mediated by so much intricate specialized knowledge that nobody can master all of this. And so what we're really seeing in all of this denial, and it's not just science denial. So, we're kind of skeptical about our car mechanics and we're skeptical about, the quality of the clothing. We're skeptical about everything because we don't understand the processes that generate that thing, because they are now so specialized and so technical, and it's never going to be possible to master all of this. So the only thing we can do is step back from all of it and be skeptical and rely on our trust in individuals to help us pick out which one of these perspectives we can count on. So I hope that makes some sense, and I'd be interested in your perspective on this.
My perspective is to take what you've said and amplify it 1,000 times. You cannot change one person and release them back to the group and expect a change, right? That's Kurt Lewin, right? You can't change one person and then send them back to QAnon and think they're not going to pick up these ideas again. You can't give someone some information about vaccine use and then send them back to their Facebook groups and expect that to stick. I think this absolutely occurs at a community level, and health interventions, putting more mammogram carts in low-income areas did not increase use of mammograms, right? There's a distrust there, and increasing access and providing information has not worked in very few health interventions. So I completely agree with you that I see this as a community-wide intervention where we need to trust our experts because of the epistemic errors we make. The further we are from the knowledge of how the information comes about, the more we'll distrust. So I completely agree with every statement you've made. And in particular, in this model towards the back end of it, I was basing this on the theory of planned behavior. And I think that norms and perceived control also play a role, but I didn't have room for it. So this is the skeletal presentation. I completely agree that this is a societal intervention, being that I tried to evidence in one individual's mind, but I agree that it's happening at a bigger level.
So there's the possibility in acknowledging that this is a sociocultural phenomenon, that we need to reconsider the distribution of work and the way that we carve up the world into specialties. I mean, that the way we're doing it now is a product of our technical advancements. And we might need to rethink that. And okay, that might sound bizarre, but the point being that it's not necessarily the case that the fixes to a sociocultural phenomenon are at the psychological level. We might need to think bigger than that.
Right.
Even things like, gosh, the way we design degree programs at the university. We have them sort of stovepiped and carved up, and maybe we need to rethink that.
Val, pardon me, can we take another question from Corey? He's been waiting.
Absolutely.
Okay. Kim, I was just going to say that I do think your research has application to IO. So one thing that really jumped out to me is past research in terms of utility analysis and expectancy charts. And I think those people in the C-suites, they're very receptive to data and evidence-based, especially if it's tied to dollars, data tied to dollars. In, one sense, I understand, skepticism and science at, proletariat, regular people. But I think we look at our society's response to COVID, businesses, they require masks. And I think that came from a C-suite. Someone made that decision that this is good for our business requiring that, right? And so maybe it wasn't, altruistic or really understanding science. But I do think, science can inform. I think what science doesn't do a very good job of is putting that data in a format that people can understand it and make decisions with it, right? As scientists, we understand it at a different level. You can't go to a manager and talk about the scientific method. They just don't understand anything about that. But if you can give it to them in a format with data that they can process and understand to go in their decision-making process, then I think you can have something, and they really do respond well often. But just more of a discussion point than a question, but I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree with that as well, because there's some fault also. I don't know if fault's the right, but there's a history of academics being in their ivory tower and not communicating well and not making that connection to people and saying, just do this, right? So recently the term in health psychology has turned from compliance to doctor's orders to adherence with doctor's orders to make them a more active participant. And I think that when people are spoken down to, they're not more likely to listen, and not even spoken down to, but they don't have the same values and they don't have the same value for having a randomized control trial than we do. So maybe we don't focus on that part, right? We try and meet people where their interests lie. And I think that's something that scientists need to realize, is that maybe we can help by changing the way we present data and by the way that we make those connections and in the language that we used.
All right. Thank you for your questions, and thank you, Kim, for your presentation. We really appreciate you speaking with us.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoy doing this, and it, energizes me I'll be working on this all weekend. I really love talking about it and getting going on it. So thank you for giving me that motivation.
Okay, goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, Kim.
Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you.